Hey, I'm Bob at ILikeToMakeStuff. Today I'm going to show you how to make a box that's also a clock. I started out with a clock kit that I found on eBay. You can get them on Amazon, and I'll put some links down in the description for you to find everything you need for this project. But this kit has everything you need in it, including instructions that show exactly where to put all the components on the board. The board's actually drawn out with the shapes of all the components there, so even if you don't know what the pieces are, it's really easy to find the right ones and stick them in place. Now, one of the problems I had with this particular kit is that the instructions were in another language, so I just kind of had to go on my knowledge of electronics and just following the pictures on the board. Once I got all the pieces in place, I bent the wires to hold all the components where they needed to be, and then flipped it over and soldered on each connection. Finally, plug in the integrated circuit, which is the brain of the clock. If you don't already, you should definitely keep a stockpile of old cell phone chargers and things, because it's really handy to just have a power adapter when you need one. I found one that fit the right voltage, stripped the wires, and plugged it into the board. It happened to be 5 volts, which is really common, and I ended up having 3 or 4 different chargers that would have worked. Plugged in the adapter, and it fired right up. You notice there's 2 tiny buttons on the front that you can use to set the clock. I'll have to change those later. Next, I moved on to making the box. It's going to be covered in veneer, so I just used some scrap pine that I had. So I wasn't specific about the material, but I was very specific about the size. You're going to have to measure out all the different sides that you need to make a cube. I found the center point of the front piece, and then figured out exactly where I wanted the display to be. And holding that in place, I traced the board so that I knew where to notch out so that the clock could sit down in the wood. I used a Forstner bit just to get rid of most of the material, and then came back with a chisel to knock out the corners. Now, setting the clock in place, I was able to find exactly where the wires were going to feed through behind it so that I could drill some holes. There are 3 holes so that I can feed the power wire through, but then I'm also going to extend the 2 buttons into buttons that I can mount on the back of the clock. I cut 4 lengths of wire and then stripped the ends off of each one. I pre-soldered the ends so they'd be easy to attach, and then soldered 1 wire onto the back side of each one of the buttons. Each button got 2 wires. Then I had to make some holes in the back panel to accept the buttons. I found the center point and then measured over 3/4 of an inch in each direction. I drilled a 1/2 inch hole for each one of the buttons and then used a Forstner bit on the back side just to thin out the face of the material. After making sure that I had all the pieces laid out in the right place, I used the brad nailer to connect it all together. You can see that some of this wood is a little bit warped. It worked out fine, but I think in the future I would probably be a little more selective on the wood that I used. I had to take out the power wire so that I could feed it up through the hole, and then feed the button wires down through the hole. Here you can see that it's really important to get the cutout the right depth so that the clock will sit flush with the face of the wood. Next, I started on the veneer, and I cut some pieces that were oversized and only cut them 2 at a time. The veneer is a multi-stage process. You can really only do 2 sides at a time. So I did one side, laid the clock in place, and then did the top. Then you have to weight it down and wait for it to dry before you can do the other sides. I used a utility knife to trim off the excess, and here's a place where you could definitely be more careful than I was. I got a little too close to the edge, and it probably would have been best to leave a little bit more overhang and then come back with a plane or a sander or something just to knock it down. That would help stop the gaps that end up between 2 pieces of veneer. I did all of the sides, leaving the front of the clock for last. I wanted to make sure that the edges were as close as possible, since it'll be the one that you're really looking at. On the front face, I got rid of as much extra glue and veneer as I could with a knife and with a sanding block, because I want the veneer on the front to sit as flush as it possibly can. I set veneer on the front of the clock and lightly traced where the clock was so that I wouldn't put wood glue in that area. Instead, I used some spray adhesive in that area and then block off the electronics and put spray adhesive on the display itself. And after that dried, I came back and trimmed off the excess, leaving a little bit more so that I could sand it off this time. I had to open up the holes that I had drilled on the back panel through the veneer. The buttons that go in here have a little bezel around them, so I had to put them in after the veneer went on. Each button has a nut that screws on the back of it, so I added that to the wires and then fed the wires up through the hole. Make sure you get the correct pair of wires and solder them onto the button. Then you just push the button down into the hole. I had to drill one last hole so the power cord could come through the box. So I measured the center of the box and just did a 3/8 inch hole. Then, making sure that it was not plugged in, I cut the power wire in half and then stripped all 4 individual wires. I took the 2 wires from the adapter, fed them through the hole, and then tied them in a knot so that they couldn't pull back out. Then, making sure to get the correct pair, I used some wire nuts just to twist them together. Now, it would probably be a good idea to come back and wrap each one of these in some electrical tape as well. So as a proof of concept, I think it worked all right, but if I were to do another one of these, there are several things I would do differently that I think would make it a lot better. One, I would spend more time on the veneer. I would be more careful with how I cut it because I had to go back and fill these tiny little gaps with wood filler and it just didn't quite look right. Second, I would get a veneer that didn't have figuring so that it wouldn't obscure the numbers any more than it had to. And 3, I would probably get a different clock for a few reasons. One, the display is not really bright enough for what I'm trying to do here. I would prefer for it to be a lot brighter and show through the veneer more. And also, this seems to be a 24-hour clock, which isn't very useful for me personally because the instructions are in a different language. I don't know if I can change the setting to turn it into a 12-hour clock or not. So when you look for a clock, you might want to look for one that has instructions in English. Now, if there's somebody out there that has more experience doing veneers and you have some recommendations, some tips or something, please leave those in the comments, both for me and for anybody that wants to make something like this. If you like this project, be sure to hit the like button down there and share it around. That helps me out quite a bit. If you want to see some more project videos, I've got some there. And don't forget, on September 9th at 9:30 p.m., I have a new episode of Brain Pick coming up with Jay Bates. It's going to be awesome. Come hang out with us live there and ask us some questions. We can talk about projects or whatever. And get in touch with me on social media and all the different networks and show me some stuff that you're working on. Have a conversation. I'd love to hang out with you and talk with you there. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next time.